So we're here tonight to talk about the remarkable clocks of Andrew V. Strait of Sidney, New York. You will note at the bottom of the first slide that the research I'm going over tonight was taken from a book that Helen Boyce and I wrote together about 10 years ago or so, and it was published by NAWCC, which we're very grateful for, called An Empire in Time, Clocks and Clockmakers of Upstate New York. And as it notes, all of the photos are by me unless otherwise noted. So when we mention the name of Andrew V. Strait, it certainly isn't a name that reverberates through the clock collecting world. Certainly doesn't bring immediate name product recognition, but perhaps in fairness it should, because few of the makers that we enjoy can truly claim that they invented a genre of clocks, but Mr. Strait can. Who was Andrew Van Wert Strait? He was born at West Oneonta, Otsego County, New York, May 1849, son of Alvinza and Hannah Van Wert Strait. They had great names back then. Little is known about his early years. We do know that he apprenticed as a jeweler goldsmith at Oechsle, New York. Oechsle just a little bit west of Binghamton. And by 1880, he had settled with his wife Alice in the village of Sidney, which is located approximately 30 miles northeast of Binghamton, New York, and 5 miles southwest of Oneonta, New York. If you've been traveling through upstate, perhaps you'll recognize some of those locations. So I provided this Rand McNally map of central New York to provide some reference points in our discussion. We mentioned that Andrew Van Wert Strait was located for most of his life in Sidney, New York, and you can see that Sidney's located about halfway between Binghamton on the south and Oneonta to the east. A few other place names. We mentioned Oechsle, which is located west of Binghamton, right along in the southern tier. We'll be talking a bit about Sidney Advertising Clocks and activities in Ithaca, New York, which is over on the far left of the map. Syracuse up here for reference, and of course Homer, which I have to mention because that's where I live. So we have a few ads here from the Sidney newspaper. One is dated 1884. It states AV Strait watches and jewelry. If you want genuine goods in this line, be sure and buy of a reliable and responsible dealer, one whose work you can rely upon, whose work you can rely. This is absolutely necessary in these days of so much deception. So things haven't changed too much in the business world. And below that, in 1885, note that he repeats this emphasis, noting his talent as a practical watchmaker and jeweler. So far we have little in terms of knowledge of Andrew Strait that would give us any idea that he was really any different than the dozens of similar jewelers, goldsmiths in surrounding localities in New York, most of whom, of course, had been trained in the tradition of clockmaking and watchmaking, certainly clock and watch repair, but it was part of the apprenticeship training in most cases, even in the early 1800s, that apprentices would have to make their own clocks and perhaps even watches. So his days as a normal run-of-the-mill jeweler goldsmith in a little rural community in upstate New York were about to change, and we see that in this ad in the Sidney newspaper of November 26, 1885, which announces a regulator has been placed in the office of the Sidney House, which was the local hotel, of course, with an attachment to the pendulum which displays advertising cards at stated intervals. Mr. A.V. Strait is the gentleman who breathed upon this invention and gave it life. So, note the date, November 26, 1885. And this was the invention. The invention was formally approved for patent not until July 1886, by which time many clocks had already been produced. So we'll talk about some of the characteristics of these early clocks. And of course, this is the patent model drawing he submitted with his patent request. And it shows standard Connecticut-made timepiece movement. And some of the features basically are, if you'll notice in the middle of the dial, in shadow, it shows a cam wheel attached to the minute wheel, excuse me, the minute arbor, and a drop arm off to the side here that's attached to the rear of the movement. When that arm falls off the cam, this arm that extends down to the lower part of the case rings a bell over here to the right, and also activates a spring-driven movement in the lower part of the case, which activates 3 cylinders in the base of the clock. And on these 3 cylinders are located 3 ads apiece. This spring-driven movement essentially turns the center cylinder in the base, and those cylinders are meshed together by corrugated brass lower portion of each frame. So when the center cylinder turns, the 2 cylinders on the side turn as well. The Strait business plan was one of the more intriguing aspects of Strait's entire business process, really, because it was really quite unique. He would invent a product like the advertising clocks and assign that patent to a group of investors. This was his way of getting the investors to front the funds to start up the manufacturing operations. Strait maintained the day-to-day management responsibilities and obviously received a share of the profits while holding what I call one of the first work-from-home jobs. His headquarters were in his home on Pleasant Street in Sydney throughout his career. And probably the most intriguing and surprising part of his business plan was he actually gave his clocks away, which is hard to sort of get your head around. But remember, this was the guy that really for the first time melded clocks and advertising together in a profit-making way. And actually his ad revenue was enough to make profits, and supposedly, and probably anecdotally, within 6 months after renting out basically ads on his clocks, supposedly that covered all of the costs of the clocks, so that every receipt after that was pure profit. And he actually practiced this business plan throughout his career, and it included other products besides just the advertising clocks. Okay, some more newspaper articles, which are really so important to provide firsthand knowledge of what Strait was up to. And I have to thank Helen Boyce for finding these. All of the records, or the extant records of Andrew V. Strait, at some point, we're not sure who did it, but whoever did it, we thank them, were turned over to the Sydney Public Library, and you can still go there today and fish through all of these records, which Helen did. The investors, and we can see in the ad at the top, Misters Thornton, Jennings, Peter Ritten, and Eugene Griggs have purchased joint interest in the Strait clock advertising patent and have decided to manufacture 100 clocks. The idea is a capital one, and money will be realized if properly carried out. And whoever the editor was of this newspaper had quite a flair. Tall oaks from little acorns grow, and we hope before long to see a giant tree branching out from the present little industry. And the marketing began. The agents started going out around the country. Lower left-hand corner, the clock advertising company of this place had placed an agent on the road to solicit orders for advertisements. Mr. W.E. Secor has charge of the matter. The company gives away the clock and sells the advertising spaces in perpetuity. The offer is a liberal one. The next one's over. Mr. Frank Jennings returned last week from an extended tour through Connecticut in the interest of the Sidney Advertising Clock Company. The demand for these ingenious clocks has become very active and promises to pay as well as a good bore of petroleum. Their stock, like the elevated railroad script, remains firm. Wonderful. Mr. Frank Jennings actually was a pretty important individual in terms of the overall advertising clock company because, as we'll see later, eventually he and his sons were in charge of the marketing of these clocks throughout most of the country, and they worked out of an office in Chicago. And it's been remarkable to me over the years to find out how many of these advertising clocks show up in the Midwest. Hundreds and hundreds of these had to have been sold in the Midwest. They're literally everywhere, and that's thanks to Frank Jennings and his office, sales office in Chicago. And lastly, at the bottom, the Sidney Advertising Clock Company is shipping a large number of clocks to Michigan and other western states. Okay, some of the pictures of the advertising clock mechanisms of patent number 1. We find 8-day timepieces with a simple calendar attachment, and most of these are by New Haven or Seth Thomas. We talked about how the mechanism activated the lower advertising. Note that a rod extends down from the movement, and when activated at 5-minute intervals, pulls up this yoke, then drops. It rings the bell over here and releases the center cylinder, which is then powered by this very large spring-driven mechanism. And here's the vertical shaft that turns the cylinder. And again, as it does so, the other cylinders turn in unison. Some of the characteristics of the early clocks. The early clocks featured cherry, chestnut, mahogany, and butternut woods. The production models included simple calendar mechanisms, as we just mentioned. A prominent local establishment was found which agreed to place the clock in a high-traffic location. So picture the Sidney Advertising Clock salesperson arriving in your little burg out in the middle of Iowa, and they scope out the town, and I suspect they usually found the most prominent hotel, lacking that, maybe a jeweler's window, or in any case, some other prominent location. So they walk into the establishment and say, hi, I'm looking to place one of these huge, exciting, beautiful, attention-grabbing clocks, and I will put it in your location, your hotel, for free. All you need to do is find a prominent wall on which to hang it. Sounds like a pretty good deal to the hotelier. So they would find a location, they would place their clock. The next stop was to a local jeweler who was recruited to keep the clock in order, and in doing so, probably on a quid pro quo basis, the individual would have his name placed in the center of the dial, as on this clock that says L.T. Burns Jeweler. In exchange for this free advertising, the jeweler would simply be asked to keep the clock running. Pretty good deal. These were advertising clocks. He got his money by selling ads, so obviously the advertising space was very important. Ad space was available on these early clocks on the center glass panel, although this individual clock, I think, must have been a very early clock because they basically took up the entire advertising space on the tablet in the middle, tooting their own horn, basically stating advertising changes every 5 minutes, Sidney Advertising Clock Company. But of course, the ads do appear on the lower cylinder. There are 9 ads, 3 on each cylinder, and on these early clocks, although you may be able to see it or may not, these are rounded glass frames. So it's curved glass. So they had to have somebody make that curved glass, and it sits in a big wooden frame which can totally be removed to access the advertising panels. Most of these cases featured a decorative bracket on the base, these early clocks, And in terms of the size of the clocks, the cases are basically huge, just inches short of 6 feet tall and 28 inches wide. Early clock characteristics in close-up. The center glass, most of the center glass tablets had ads on at least the upper half. Many had multiple ads covering the entire tablet. We mentioned how the dial typically and almost universally had the name of the local jeweler who was in exchange to take care of the clock and keep it running. And the lower ad panels. And on this picture, you can definitely see how the curved glass panels on the base worked. The ads were held in with brass strips, all part of this general framework. You can see the corrugated brass bases that mesh with each other. The ads slipped into these little brass frames. And if you're lucky enough to find original ads, you can usually, by checking out one or two, or in this case, all of them, they mention Taconic, Pennsylvania. So this clock, obviously at one point in its life, was in Taconic, Pennsylvania, which is, I don't know, 35, 40 miles, maybe a little bit more south of Binghamton in northern Pennsylvania. Other early clocks. We've included a number of pictures here. On this clock, the jeweler ad was not only in the middle of the dial, but also placed on and along the upper cornice. You can see J.R. Murdoch Jeweler. You can see this is similar to the first case that we looked at with the lower bracket base. The construction of most of the early Sidney cases was contracted out to a gentleman named Charles A. Burr of nearby Rosedale, New York. This clock, pictured in original as-found condition that was at Catone's auction in upstate New York some years back, is, as you notice, missing its ads and looks like also the lower cylinders. Even when the lower cylinders are there, many of these clocks, if not most of them, have unfortunately lost their original ads. Obviously, original ads are much, much more desirable and harder to find. On this clock, you'll note that it appears to have a replaced simple calendar dial, but it has a wonderful original tablet of a Mr. Brigham, a dealer in coal, wood, ice, Eddy refrigerators, etc. Unfortunately, they didn't leave a place name on the glass, so we can't really tell where this one was originally placed. With success came change. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll note that by February 1888, 600 clocks have been made and sold. Not bad. To the right, rumors are abroad in the land that the Sidney Clock Company contemplates an early removal to the embryo city of Ithaca. Not sure why they said it was the embryo city of Ithaca, because I think if Ithaca was probably then and now many times larger than Sidney, but in any case, the editor was going to be sorry to lose them. Then a more substantial discussion of why they moved on the lower left-hand corner. Why did they move? For the simple reason they can manufacture a better and cheaper clock in that city and greatly reduce their current expenditures. Their headquarters in Ithaca will be at the Ithaca Calendar Clock Factory, where their cases and entire clockworks will be manufactured. At present, the Sidney Clock Company is obliged to have the clockworks manufactured in Connecticut and the advertising attachments and cases manufactured elsewhere. The result is an enormous expense, which will now be saved by having the entire clock, the works, cases, printing, and painting turned out under one roof. Besides this, the Sidney Clock Company is offered office room electricity and steam rent-free. Indeed they were, and of course some of these facts turned out not quite to be true, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in any case, this really does cement the fact that they did have their later versions of the early clocks made at Ithaca. And Ithaca research by Joel Warren, the main chronicler of the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company, who's done wonderful research. also bore this out, and he notes in his research that they offered office space and the use of their workmen and shops to many different enterprises, basically to keep their workers busy, especially in otherwise dry seasons. And finally, January 1890, the clock factory will move from this place to Ithaca early in January. Mr. Skinner sold out his interest and retired from the business about a month ago. Jennings Brothers will conduct the eastern and western branches, and the printing will be done as heretofore by Mr. Weir. That's very important because the ads on these clocks are very, very distinctive and wonderful, really done with a flair. And I think it would have been a big problem had they decided to switch their printers to somebody in Ithaca with their move. So, to review again, why the move to Ithaca? The Ithaca Calendar Clock Company had a significant amount of unused space in its factory and constantly sought out additional work, again, as proven and shown by Joel Warren's research. The Ithaca Calendar Clock Company had a highly skilled workforce and the most up-to-date machinery, and the potential efficiencies meant that the advertising clocks could be made more quickly and cheaply than at Sidney. I think that's pretty demonstrable. The production changes could be accomplished while maintaining all of the current marketing and sales staff, most of which stayed in Sidney, and the business operations and Mr. Strait, of course, continued to be based at Sidney. And as we noted, the use of the Sidney-based Weir Brothers printers so integral to the success of the advertising component continued. Some case modifications accompanied the move to Ithaca, and I would pose that one is able to distinguish the Ithaca cases from the Sidney cases fairly quickly. Now, on July 3rd, 1888, so about 6 months prior to the move to Ithaca, Strait did receive a patent for a revision to the mechanism that turned the drums on the bottom. With this modification, the clock base was changed from a rounded 3-panel glass lower door frame to a flat single-panel glass front. As we can see in this picture, that flat panel covered the 3 ad cylinders. You can understand that this was probably a good idea in terms of saving on the cost of the production of this lower glass panel. And you can tell these clocks from a distance because on these later clocks, Ithaca-made clock cases, or the ones after the change in the lower movement, this lower panel now has little flat wood inserts that state cards change every 5 minutes. The original clocks did not have those. So you can tell the Ithaca cases pretty readily whether they have those or if they don't have those. Now, whether these case modifications were timed exactly with the move to Ithaca or preceded it by a few months is not known, but all of the subsequent Ithaca-made cases were of this style. The label changes also followed suit. The one on the left is the Sidney-made case clock labels. Pretty simple and direct, how to adjust the pendulum, how to regulate the simple calendar hand, how to change the advertising cards, and at the bottom you'll note it states Sidney Advertising Clock Company, Sidney, New York, printed by Weir Brothers printers. When they moved to Ithaca, the label changes. The format is pretty much the same. They changed the order. But at the base, you'll see that it states Sidney Advertising Clock Company, Chicago, Illinois, the home of the Midwest Sales Office, and Ithaca, New York. Very interesting. Okay, characteristics of the Ithaca-made cases. This wonderful original Ithaca-produced clock shown on the right reflects all of the basic characteristics of the Ithaca-made cases. While the case retains the size of the earlier clocks, the case features are simplified and standardized. So I'm asserting basically that if you look at the moldings and the frame parts, etc., they're all basically the same in the Ithaca clocks. What does change, of course, are the tops and bottoms. And by doing so, you can really change the appearances of these clocks. But the basic cases are pretty much all the same. The wood changes also. Remember, we're making clocks now in the Ithaca calendar clock factory, so they're using the woods that they use to make the Ithaca calendar clock cases, which are predominantly oak and ash woods. These later clocks were designed to maximize ad space, a little bit more so than the earlier clocks, as most also incorporated ad panels at the top and the base, which extended the height of these clocks to nearly 8 feet. And that's, we see a good example here with the extra ad panel on the top of the clock and then another flat panel on the base. As I noted, the variations in the top and base ad panel shapes and layouts made for considerable differences in overall appearance despite the standardized case design. Now, as you may have gathered, if you can see enough of the tablets, this clock originated or was originally placed in a lovely little burg just north of Oneonta called Schenerus, New York. And there'll be a quiz later on how to spell Schenerus. The Schenerus clock in close-up. So we have the top panel, which is advertising cigars. And if you bought the West End variety, they were 10 cents a piece. And the Little Giant cigars were 5 cents a piece, manufactured by Hummel & Company, Schenerus. Back then, just about every town and village had its own cigar maker. Below that, we see the ad cylinders in the lower ad panel and showing some wonderful Weir Brothers produced ads for the Schenerus National Bank, Dawley and Wright Monuments, and another cigar producer, Headlight Cigars, 5 cents. And then on the right, this fantastic center tablet panel advertising Horace Chester's Insurance Agency. All losses paid promptly. And then the Schenerus Pharmacy, which also sells crockery, lamps, prints, paints, oils, school books, and wallpaper. Now, I would note that at some time in its life, this clock fell into the hands of someone who wanted to produce some more tablets and some more ads for clocks that obviously needed them. This top panel, the Hummel & Company, and the center tablet are absolutely original to this clock. But you will see, if you look long enough, this center tablet, I've seen at least 6 other clocks with this center tablet, and also seen a number of clocks with this ad panel. Sometimes this ad appears not on the top, but on the bottom. But in any case, the clock you're looking at is the original. Others have been copied. I should also note at this point that throughout the 70s and into the 80s, there were several otherwise responsible individuals, but clock collectors who did obtain and did look for beat-up Sidney cases, found those, and then reconstructed cases, basically to save the clocks, to which they should be commended. But in any case, they did mix and match case parts at times. Not to get anybody nervous, but some clocks out there have been constructed using parts found from other clocks, which I guess if it helps these clocks survive is a wonderful endeavor. Some typically wonderful examples of the early Ithaca type clocks are shown here. The one on the left, Mr. Stockwell, Stowe's General Hardware. I think Rumsey is the name of the jeweler on the center tablet. We're advertising Dr. Moore's resident dentistry, and I don't know if you can see the lower language or not, but he advertises that he extracts teeth without pain with his new electric vibrator. I'm sorry, that won't be part of this discussion tonight, but I'm sure maybe the next talk someone can cover that. In any case, we don't have any other place name, and as you can see, the ads on the left-hand clock are not original, so we're not really sure where this came from, but it's a beautiful clock. And on the right, notice they've used the cornice molding on the top to advertise the druggist. and we have a jeweler named Mr. Penny. We have a fantastic center tablet, Carpenter House, and then the Louisville dry goods store, and some fantastic original multicolor ads on the bottom. Now, I'm not sure this was Louisville, Kentucky, but maybe it was. In any case, this clock sold at the James Julia auction up in Maine some years back, and hopefully one of you out there has this fantastic original clock, again, of the Ithaca variety. Continued on the left-hand side, a clock that apparently came out of Carthage, New York, which is up on the near the Canadian border in upstate New York, because we're advertising the insurance agency Hood and Mulligan. I'm not sure the Coca-Cola ad at the top was original. If it is, the price of this clock just tripled. In any case, not a bad choice. You'll note that the bottom bracket is missing on this clock, and the ads are not original, but still a great case. And on the right-hand side, very interesting clock with an original top. It advertises on the center panel the Mohawk Mountain House, which is an historic Catskill mountain resort. It has what appear to be original ads on the bottom, but I believe, although I'm not positive, I believe those were copied from originals and placed in there. In any case, beautiful, beautiful clock, mostly original. Okay, a few sleepers, only because both of them have the name sleeper in them. On the left-hand side, so whenever they arrived in this town, and I'm not sure where it was, basically Mr. O.H. Sleeper bought up the whole clock and most of the advertising. His name is in the top, his name is on the dial, and his name's on the glass. He's a dealer in diamonds, jewelry, and silverware, watches, and clocks. Repairing done in the finest way and warranted. Note at the bottom, when you look at these ads, these turn-of-the-century replacement ads are found all the time on these clocks. And in fact, both of the clocks shown on this slide have these ads. And I guess if you're going to find replacements, they're certainly better than just about anything else other than the originals, because they are decorative and very interesting printing and interesting subjects. And on the right-hand side, an otherwise wonderful original clock. Too bad the ads aren't original, but what a great oak case. At the top, Mr. James Dentist, again, teeth extracted without pain. Great ads in the middle, and you'll note this clock, thank you for putting the place name finally on one of these, came from Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. I have no idea where it is, but it sounds like a great place. Okay, I think at this point we're going to, nope, we're not going to address questions. We have a little bit more to go. Okay, so despite the success of his first patent model, Strait soon came up with a completely new design. So the patent for this model was filed in 1888, just a few months after his first patent was granted, as you remember, July of 1888. The patent for this second model was issued in February 1889. This new model, which is similar to what we looked at earlier, combines a very large clock with an automated, two automated ad panels. Instead of being horizontally located at the base of the clock, these ad panels were presented vertically on two vertical triangular rotating columns. And on the patent model, you'll note that there are 3 ads per column face, which means 9 ads per cylinder. Until recently, little attention was paid to this patent, as no examples had been seen, and researchers and collectors assumed that they had never been produced. However, in doing our research, Helen and I came across this ad. Actually, it was printed on some company letterhead and envelopes found in the Sydney Public Library. And the fact that an actual clock had been photographed basically for this purpose was proof that somebody at some point, Mr. Strait, at some point actually produced these clocks. The problem was we'd never seen one, and when we did the book in 2003, the article notes that they must exist, but nobody's come up with one yet. In the Sidney records, we found a description of the clocks. It stated the top advertisement, 10 by 18 inches, bottom advertisement, 10 by 16. The revolving ads, 7 by 14 inches each. The height, 6'6", the width, 1'8", depth 1 foot. Movement 8-day, although in the production models, most of them are actually 15-day. Manufactured by the Seth Thomas Clock Company, guaranteed for 5 years. From what could be deciphered from the poor print, I think this clock may have come from or been placed in Oxford, New York, which is in northern Shenango County. So this is an actual production model of the second patent model. So we now know that there are at least 2, and certainly more, of these patent number 2 models surviving. The first, which is apparently an early, certainly earlier than the clock I just showed, production model, perhaps pre-production model, is shown. Now, this I saw at the Springfield, Missouri National some years ago when a gentleman named Roy Burlingame presented these pictures and also a reproduction clock that he made based on these pictures. An absolutely fantastic job. Wonderful, wonderful display. I apologize for taking a lousy photo of his photo, but in any case, this was the photo of the actual clock that Roy saw somewhere in some collection. And if we note if we look at the patent model drawing in the upper right-hand corner, we can see it bears a lot of characteristics with that, including the upper panel, the overall case size, and the fact that in the patent model there are 3 ads per panel face, and on this first very early production model also 3 ads per panel. And if you note on the photo in the lower right, these are actually original ads on certainly some of the panels, and there are 3 ads per front or 9 per cylinder. So the second extant version of the patent model 2 is clearly the production model. The case is much simplified from the patent model and that first production model. It's made of oak with crest decorations typical of those found on other Ithaca calendar clock company made cases. The triangular ad columns hold a total of 6 ads each. Note that instead of 3 ads per column face, excuse me, there are only 2 ads. I'll talk about that in a second. The difference between this and the earlier clocks was the earlier clocks rotated on a 5-minute basis. These triangular vertical columns turn continuously as the clock runs. Note that this example was not equipped with the upper and lower flat ad panels as shown in the file photo, and it doesn't appear to me that this clock ever had those additional panels. Why produce the second patent model and when? The simplest explanation for why the second model would be produced is that the company made its money from advertising, and the new model had a minimum of 12 ads per clock, excluding the dial, top, and base ads, while the first patent model with the rotating drums held only 9 ads. Why did the production models use only 2 ads per panel side instead of the 3 shown on the patent and on the pre-production model? My guess is it's because the ads were too small to be seen at a distance. There may have been another logical reason, but it escapes me. When, despite the fact that the second patent model was patented in 1889, it appears from the number of extant clocks and anecdotal information from the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company that these were not produced at least until the late 1890s or perhaps even into the early 1900s. And we get that information from a recording of the last surviving worker from the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company that some of the folks in central New York obtained. I think it was in the early 1970s. That individual had actually been involved in making these large cases for the Sidney Advertising Clock Company. And he was an employee from the mid-late, about 1907 until the demise of the Calendar Clock Company around 1915. And he stated that's when these clocks were being made. When Strait introduced his new second patent model, he changed the company's name to Strait's Automatic Advertising Clock Company, obviously reflecting the fact that the ads turned continuously. Second patent model characteristics: these clocks have 15-day double-line Seth Thomas movements, altered with a cam wheel attached to the minute arbor, which turns a pinion on a horizontal axis, which extends to the pinwheels on each side. And you can see that in this drawing here. Here's the horizontal shaft, which goes to the pinwheel on either side, and these interact with similar pinwheels on the vertical shafts that go down to the advertising panels. As the clock ticks away, the panels move. The rotating ad panels shown on the lower left are original ads for establishments at and around St. Johnsville, New York, which is a little village on the Mohawk River, also the Erie Canal, located between Utica and Albany. As with the first patent model clocks, the dial centers typically featured names of the jewelers who maintained the clocks. In this case, Mr. Dewandelier, jeweler. Okay, the second patent model in action, and hopefully this will work. Since there aren't many of these around, I guess not too many people have actually seen one in action, and so I attempted this video to show everyone how it works. Now, these don't go zipping around. They move with the clock as it ticks. But if you watch long enough, you can see them working their way around. And we'll take a look at a few of the ads here that are on these panels. Mr. Honeycutt's Barber Shop. You can also leave your laundry while you're getting your haircut. Beer company ads were a big favorite here. This one, Ale and Lager. Billival cream separators, they're still in business, obviously. Notice this has a pasted-on lithograph of a woman and a child, and also Regina talking machines and music boxes. As time went on, the Weir ads got more and more exotic, if you will. They used multi-colors and sparkly colors on their ads, and some of those are shown here. Okay, we're going to pause here at the end of the talk of the advertising clocks and see if anybody has any questions. Katie, okay. Do you have any questions?
Yes, we do have one so far. And please, if you have any more, go ahead and type them into the question box. Okay, our first one is, did the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company simply manufacture the clocks for the Sidney Clock Company, or were they a partner in the advertising business? Did Ithaca mark these clocks so people would know where they were actually manufactured?
All the research to date, very good question. All the research to date indicates that if you remember the description in the Sidney newspaper describing why they were going to Ithaca, all indications are that this was a business relationship between Strait and the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company to produce the cases for his clocks and perhaps to assemble them, more likely to assemble them at the factory. All of the advertisements continued to be handled out of Sydney with Weir Brothers, and I'm sure Mr. Strait was taking good care of that part of the operation. The clocks apparently were shipped from the Calendar Clock Company to the sales outlets in Chicago and elsewhere. And so no, there's no indication that Ithaca Calendar Clock Company controlled or owned the Sidney Advertising Clock Company during this period. All indications are that all of the business arrangements were still handled by Strait out of Sydney, and the Ithaca connection was a contract connection. Other questions?
Okay, next one is from Robert, and it says, do you know of anyone that reproduces the lower movement for the clock?
Great question. The answer is no, but that doesn't mean there might not be somebody out there, and maybe afterwards, if anybody's aware of anyone that's producing the lower clock mechanism, maybe they can put it on one of the forums or something. I know there's a gentleman who I've met, whose name I can't remember, unfortunately, hopefully he's with us tonight, that has made for many years a lot of the case components for the rebuild some missing parts and stuff from the cases. And I think he's out in Iowa or Missouri or somewhere west of the Mississippi. So there are aficionados out there that are making some replacement parts to help reconstruct the clocks, but I'm not certain about the movements.
Okay. Next question is, did they have any competition doing the same type of advertising on clocks?
Well, this did spur some others, but I don't think there was anyone that I can recall that was doing what Sidney or what Strait attempted to do. Was there certainly wasn't anybody out there giving away their clocks. There wasn't anybody out there that I know of, and I can certainly be corrected, that was basically using the clocks as billboards with rotating ads. Obviously, there were other advertising clock companies. Think of the Baird clocks. But of course, once those were made, the ads never changed because the ads were basically incorporated in the construction of the clocks. So a number of other styles of clocks that had tablets of various companies to promote their firms. Lots of clocks were sold as premiums. If you bought enough soap and stuff, then you'd get a clock, or other products, and then you'd get a clock with that company's name on the tablet. But I don't know of anybody else offhand that was trying to do what Sidney attempted and succeeded at.
Okay, next question. How many clocks are estimated to be manufactured for the first patent model, and how many are estimated to exist?
Great question. I've been surprised at how many of these clocks are out there. You can go to just about every national meeting and find one or two Sidney clocks. And again, it amazed me going at some of the nationals over the last decade or so out in the Midwest to see these clocks show up. So we had a little bit of an indication on one of the early ads which said that made 600 clocks probably in a couple 3-year period. So extrapolating from that, certainly in the thousands, I would think, would absolutely be defendable based on the information we've received. I don't know. You can think that the size of these clocks, sometimes if you have a big giant clock, they tend to be respected a little bit more. Maybe they're just harder to dispose of. So sometimes you can argue that these big giant clocks might survive in greater numbers than a little kitchen clock. On the other hand, when the hotel goes out of business, you can easily see how these clocks might have been discarded. How many of them are around? I've seen at least 50, probably 60 over the years, and I'm sure that's a fraction of what currently exists. So I would guess there's got to be a couple hundred at least still hanging around. Of course, a lot of those aren't in great condition. They've suffered through handling over the years and going from owner to owner. But as I said, they are certainly restorable clocks and wonderful clocks to have in any collection.
Okay, next question. How often were the cards changed based on advertising revenue, or once the clock was assembled, the company's advertising and paying always stayed the same?
That's a great question, and it's a question I don't have a succinct answer to. You'll remember that on one of the early newspaper accounts, it stated that the ads were sold in perpetuity. So that thought would be the guy shows up in town and goes to Katie's tobacco shop and says, I'll sell you this ad for such and such, and your ad will be on this clock forever. Is that really how they did this? There are suggestions in the company records that the ads changed and were resold, but there isn't any clear indication, just suggestions of that. So it's possible, lacking any more information, it's possible that this was a one-shot deal, that they sold all these ads and put these names on the clocks for the jewelers, and the clock stayed there in town. You do find some of these clocks with original ads with replacement ads placed on some of the panels, showing later companies that certainly weren't printed by Weir. So that's a great question. It just doesn't seem logical that they would have these ad mechanisms out there and not sell the ads for a certain period of time and then come back and collect more money. But it's possible that they didn't.
Okay, next question. Does the library have any factory records of businesses which received the completed advertising clocks?
I would love to have found an inventory. There are a few. There are letters that refer to certain locations. There are letters to agents in London notifying them that they're shipping clocks over there. So some of these clocks actually made it to Europe. Most of the correspondence is to agents, although there are references to some companies, but no, so far as I'm aware, there aren't any ledger books that show clocks that were sent to specific locations. That would be fantastic, of course, but I'm not aware of any.
Okay, what is the value of the two models of #1 and #2 patents?
I'm not sure that the general, well, okay, in terms of #1 and #2, the highest price I've heard of for the first patent model in its variations, both the Sidney and Ithaca's, was about $25,000, I think. That was some time back, and that must have been a fantastic clock. I have heard of others in the $10,000 to $20,000 range, but I have to say I haven't heard of any pristine clock sales in the last probably 5 or 6 years at least. So just not sure, but that'll give you an idea. I would think that the prices of the Sidney Advertising Clocks would probably hold up better over time than the standard run-of-the-mill clocks, because they appeal to a wider audience than just clock collectors because of the advertising component. So whereas most of your clocks have lost 40% of their value in the last 5 years, maybe your Sidney Advertising Clocks haven't. As far as patent model #2, that's open to conjecture because I only know of two clocks. One, the clock that Mr. Burlingame found and took pictures of, which was clearly an early production model, and then the other model that I've shown. Those are the only two I know of. There have to be more. Nobody, and I've been asking people for years, and nobody else has come up with another one. So you'd have to use your imagination on that. Obviously, they're unique and interesting and wonderfully operating clocks on a totally different theory. So I would suspect the interest would be there, but I don't know, use your imagination, I guess. Next.
And one more, how much revenue per month per ad?
That's a great question. I don't know the specific amount. Again, all I know is the anecdotal reference to the fact that within 6 months from the ads that they made enough money to cover the cost of the clock. That's a great question, and I do intend to get back to Sidney one of these days and paw through the library material again, and I think I'll be looking for any sort of information on receipt of funds from the ads. That's a good question.
Okay, and before we go on, I just wanted to mention that one of the attendees on the line did send in a chat to me that he did get a exact reproduction case, part, and lower mechanism from a gentleman, and I'll chat that information out
Great.
to everybody.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So
yeah.
I'll stop the questions for now, and we'll pick them up after your second section.
Okay, second section, not as long as the first. So we know Mr. Strait was this fantastic and inventive maker of these early advertising clocks. But if you go to his house, which is pictured on wonderful Pleasant Street in Sidney, New York, there's a little plaque out front. And whereas we might think it extols his virtues in terms of making the first advertising clocks, it doesn't. What it says is, this is the site where Andrew Van Wert Strait invented the first electric alarm clock, patented October 1902. And you might scratch your head going, what the heck are we talking about? And this is what we're talking about. This was the invention filed October 7th, 1902 for an electrical alarm clock. And to summarize the explanation there, it's the combination of a spring contact finger on a hand on the face of the dial and an annular series of push buttons around the main dial extending through to the front board over which the inner ends of the wire engaged to complete an electrical circuit to sound a bell. Okay, if you can see the drawing in the arrows, obviously we have the bell at the top. You see a little spring wire here attached to the hour hand. You see push buttons around the dial, and here's a close-up. Here's the push button. So if you want the bell to ring, you push in this button at the 5-minute or the 15-minute interval you request. When you push in this button, a little pin or shunt, as they call it, sticks out so that when the clock goes around and the hands move, when this hour hand, the little wire on the hour hand touches this shunt, an electrical connection is completed. The movement in these clocks is actually wired to run a little bit of a current through it. So when that wire touches that pin, it activates a bell. In some of these clocks, they activated a light. And these clocks are powered by a dry cell battery, not a cord and a plug, but a dry cell battery located within the case. And as I said, it either rings a bell or flashes a light to alert the attendant. Notice at the top of the description of the patent, electric alarm clock, Andrew V. Strait, a signer to Nehemiah Brown, Norwich, New York. We're going to talk again here about his business model and how he marketed these clocks. We have on this slide an early, perhaps pre-production model that has all of Strait's characteristics in it with a few early variations. This early version of the reminder clock has pull pins around the dial rather than push buttons. So when you pull the little looped wire out, out comes the shunt. Otherwise, the functions are the same. Power was derived from a dry cell battery held in the lower left-hand corner of the case. The battery was wired through the movement. On the upper right-hand side, can't see it very well, but there's a little wire wrapped around the brass movement plate, which puts a little current through the movement. With the hour hand, with a little spring wire on the hour hand, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner, and don't pay any attention to the fact that whoever put this clock back together put the wire on the minute hand. It's supposed to be on the hour hand. But in any case, you can see the little wire and how when it hits the pin, it completes the circuit. The reminder could be set, as you might notice, at 15-minute intervals over a 12-hour period. Now, this is an original lower tin painted and zinc and tin painted tablet, and it states Merwin Electric Reminder Company, Sydney. Have no idea why or where the name Merwin. Maybe it's a takeoff on Merlin. In any case, that's the only reference to that name that we find used on these clocks. The actual production models and how they were used. As with the advertising clocks, Strait obtained a primary investor for his reminder clocks. He was a doctor, Nehemiah Brown, from nearby Norwich, New York. Now, I think some of these clocks were actually made for hospital use, and maybe that's the little tie with the Dr. Nehemiah Brown. In any case, he was the individual who invested front money for Strait to produce these clocks. He was assigned an assignee on the patent, and many of these clocks were actually marketed under the name of the Norwich Clock Company. And notice on this ad in the lower right-hand corner, the Norwich Clock Company, Norwich, New York. But the clocks weren't produced at Norwich. They were produced at Sydney and nearby Bainbridge, New York. They were marketed to hotels and hospitals as clocks that would remind the staff when to wake a patron or when to administer medicine. The hotel versions were incorporated into hotel desks. That included, surprise, surprise, very large advertising panels. And if you look at the fonts and the style of these ads, you can absolutely show and see that these were produced by Weir Brothers, the same sort of basic fonts and styles that were used on the advertising clocks. So Mr. Weir is still busy making ads for Strait. As noted in the company broadside here, we manufacture reminder and call clocks and hotel desks, any size to order. The machine contains key and call boards, checks, hooks, bells, batteries, etc., enclosed in a carved oak case, nicely finished. We will instruct you how to get either clock or desk or both free. A hotel with one of these is a guarantee to a guest that they will not get left by a sleepy porter. So, Strait used the same sales approach for the hotel desks with ads as he had for his advertising clocks, using the clocks as a means to profit by selling ads. Other examples from the company archives. On the left-hand side, you see a clock, an ad hotel desk without the reminder clock, interestingly enough, but with ads that certainly appear to be produced by Weir. And then on the right-hand side, absolutely a reminder clock mechanism in the center, surrounded by key hooks, keys, mail slots, fold-down writing surfaces, bells, and advertisements. Despite the fact that these desks were clearly made in some quantity, I've never seen one. I've never seen a surviving example. Maybe that's not surprising when you consider the fact that these were produced in the early 1900s at a time when electricity was not readily available in most communities, but wait a decade later, and a lot of the large buildings in many, many communities did have wired-in electricity, so that these clocks that were powered by dry cell batteries had a fairly short time period after which, by which time they were somewhat obsolete. We found examples of standalone reminder clocks, most likely used in hospitals. In fact, the clock on the left, you can't see it, but it actually has a carry chain that goes around that you could put over your shoulder to carry this clock. The example on the left is a cherry case and has pull pins like the pre-production models seen previously, but is otherwise similar to other models. These are Seth Thomas movements, by the way. The example on the right in an oak case features some star designs on the case and fancy knurling on the little push pins at 5-minute intervals. And I note that the Strait reminder clock legacy lives on. I found 5 or 6 examples from anywhere from the 1920s, 30s up to the present day of reminder clocks that work on the exact same principle as Strait's clocks. Now, whether they used his ideas, as in this General Electric clock, which was essentially just a plug-in electric version of Strait's reminders clock. Notice that here we have pull pins that you would pull out to set up the reminders, and on this clock we have a light that lights up when the time, the set time arrives. Basically, it has all of the design characteristics of Strait's 1902 patent. Strait died in the 30s. We can pretty much say that the advertising clocks the production stopped when the Ithaca calendar clock company went under, and that was around 1915. I believe the factory was auctioned off in 1917. So basically, the clock factory didn't survive the First World War. So there goes the advertising clocks. That would indicate the end of that production. As far as the reminder clocks, certainly the ones that were powered by dry cell batteries, which so far as we know they all were probably obsolete, certainly between 1910 and maybe 1915, maybe 1920 at the latest. As we note, we don't definitely know when the reminder clocks were produced, but they might have been a victim of World War I and the economy, along with the advertising clocks, plus their obvious obsolescence as buildings became wired for electricity, although one could argue that maybe they held on in hospitals a little while longer because the dry cell batteries allowed them to be portable. Andrew Strait died on July 8, 1933, at his home on Pleasant Street, Sidney, New York, where he had carried out his business activities for decades. On his death certificate, he was simply listed as a clockmaker. He was survived by his wife, Alice, son David, and daughter Mabel. And I thank you for joining us here this evening to talk about Andrew B. Strait and his remarkable clocks, and I'm open for any additional questions you might have. Katie. Hello, Katie.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, I muted myself there. So
happens to all of us at some point.
A couple more questions.
Okay.
Dave says, I've seen American reminder clocks surrounded by ads just like the Sydney alarm clocks. The American Reminder Clock Company of Binghamton, New York, was manufacturing alarm or reminder clocks prior to 1902. Should this company be considered the first to make an alarm clock?
Actually, I don't believe I've done the research on the American Reminder Clock Company. It wasn't incorporated until late 1902, so it was actually incorporated after the patent date for the Strait clocks. I did the original research on American Reminder Clock Company. There were other companies making reminder clocks. Seth Thomas marketed hotel reminder clocks. So we have to take Strait's claim that he was the first inventor of the electric alarm clock with a little grain of salt. That certainly hasn't been proven. But you're absolutely right. The American Reminder Clock Company was operating in Binghamton. It was really an offshoot of ITR. And several of its primary principals were also involved in the ITR time clock business. Harlow Bundy, the main financier for ITR, was certainly involved directly in the American Reminder Clock Company. Their reminder clocks were somewhat similar, but built on a totally different pattern, having a panel in which pins were stuck into times and day slots to make the reminders go. But other than that, the movements were actually quite similar, and the circuitry, if you will, was similar. So there were other companies, but I don't think American Reminder predated Strait's reminder clocks.
Okay. Robert has a question. Where did the printing? Do we know who did the tablets?
Great question. A lot of the fonts on the tablets appear similar to the Weir brothers production. So my guess would probably be that Weir brothers did the tablets as well, but we don't know that for certain. Okay, and just one comment from Russ Rabago. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. He said, it would be interesting to know how many Sidney clocks exist among the participants of the webinar. I currently own 2. Great. You're lucky. Congratulations. Okay, send me some pictures. I keep a large file of photos. I'd love to have pictures that anyone might want to send me. Katie, do you want me to give my address, or do you want to just put it on the site? If you want to open it up, go ahead and August group, sure. My address is 5 Clinton Street in Homer, New York, 13077. And if you ever have interest in pictures or anything like that, send me an email. I'll be happy to share. And I'll put that information in the follow-up email that will be sent out to all the participants. Great. Too. So if you didn't catch that the first time. And just remind everyone that this session was recorded, so if you want to go back and do something, hopefully tomorrow it will be uploaded on the website, and you'll get a reminder email for that as well. Thank you, Katie. All right, and with that, we will close this session for this evening, and I want to thank Russ again and thank everyone for attending. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.